Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We will start with a new text today, having finished Catherine Malabou's The New Wounded. The text we'll start with today is again by Catherine Malabou, and this is called The Ontology of the Accident. So as the very title suggests, it looks at accident as from a philosophical framework, from a neurobiological framework, from a medical framework, but also from an existential framework. And as is the case with Malabou, this very rich and organic interdisciplinary framework is something which is very important for us, not least in a course like this, which is Trauma and Literature, which looks at trauma from a variety of perspectives: the medical, the existential, the political, the cultural, the neurobiological, etc. And of course, what we will always attempt to do through this interesting combination of theory and text is how we can apply or map these theoretical perspectives onto the different texts that we study in this course. So for instance, if you think about something like Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Sada Hassan Manto's Toba Take Sing, texts which I've already covered, in terms of how a theory like this can be mapped interestingly to offer very original readings of those texts. Now, as we already saw in The New Wounded, Malabou talks or spends a lot of time looking at plasticity as a phenomenon, as a neural phenomenon, as a psychological phenomenon, as a psychic phenomenon, but also as a general existential phenomenon. And she talks about how the concept of plasticity can be obviously drawn on from neuroscience. We talk about synaptic plasticity, etc., but also how that can be interestingly mapped onto a broader understanding of plasticity, which is philosophical in quality. Now, we see the same kind of strand run in this book as well, The Ontology of the Accident, where she talks about the idea of the accident, the experience of the accident as a transformation, as something which transforms the very core psyche, the very core self of the subject, in terms of how that generates a new subject which is unfamiliar, or shall we say defamiliarized or deterritorialized. In other words, the subject's sense of space and time begin to become almost permanently disrupted. And the production of disruption is something that Malabou talks about a lot in this book and also elsewhere. So as we can see, she talks about, she takes up all these quote-unquote negative concepts like plasticity, annihilation, destruction, etc. And then she looks at how these concepts, these experiences can be sort of viewed philosophically, theoretically, and also culturally. And this is what makes her such an important figure for the purpose of this course, Trauma and Literature, because what she does essentially is she offers almost a critical studies perspective into trauma, rather than just medicalizing it, rather than just looking at it as a neurobiological phenomenon. She also, takes that and translates that or maps that onto a broader cultural framework, a broader existential framework in terms of how our understanding of the subject may be revisited with these kinds of theoretical frames. In a moment, we'll start off with the opening section of The Ontology of the Accident, which talks about how the idea of seamlessness, that the seamless subject which moves from one point to another point like a river, and she gives example the analogy of a river as well. The idea of the fluid, seamless subject can become permanently disrupted with an accident, and by accident she uses the term very broadly. It can be a medical accident, it can be a deeply psychological wound, it can be a physical wound. In other words, the idea of trauma comes across as a very complex concept in Malabou. So we'll just start off with the opening, and then we'll see how that can be connected to the broader philosophy of this book. So here we go, and this should be on your screen, The Ontology of the Accident. In a usual order of things, lives run their course like rivers. The changes and metamorphoses of a life due to vagaries and difficulties, or simply the natural unfolding of circumstance, appear as the marks and wrinkles of a continuous, almost logical process of fulfillment that leads ultimately to death. So she starts up with a commonly consumed idea of life as something which flows seamlessly and continuously and almost endlessly. It has a starting point, it has a middle point, it just goes on, and then ultimately it reaches this destination of death, if you look at death as a destination and the end, the eventual destination. So there is this temporal, teleological, eschatological quality about life. But the important thing here is what she's trying to foreground is that the way we commonly consume the idea of life is through a seamless, fluid process of beginning, middle, and end. So it has a genesis point, the point where the subject is born, then the subject's growth area, where the subject grows, absorbing experiences around themselves, and then obviously in the end the subject dies, so it comes to an end, a closure, a conclusion. So there is a logical, teleological, temporal quality about the whole life system over here, and that's how we commonly conceive or consume the idea of life. In time, one eventually becomes who one is. One becomes only who one is. Bodily and psychic transformations do nothing but reinforce the permanence of identity, caricaturing or fixing it, but never contradicting it. They never disrupt identity, right? So the most important phrase over here, the most important part over here is the opening phrase, in the usual order of things, right? So this is how the usual order of things go. That a subject is born, the subject becomes a personality through an absorption and processing of experience, and then of course in the end the subject comes to a closure, comes to an end, right? And that's the end of the subject, the end point. Normally we find that everything that happens around the subject reinforces the permanence of identity. So identity, as we can see in Malabou already, is a very complex phenomenon. It's a process of becoming, right? And it constantly becomes something. Now, what we can see, there are sufficient hints already, and the Malabou is dropping that, the whole idea of becoming and re-becoming to become can be disrupted through an event of unbecoming, which is the trauma, right? That's where the trauma comes in. An interruption, right? I mean, we talked about interruption when we looked at, let us say, Mrs. Dalloway or Toba Tek Singh, how the subject is essentially interrupted, right? And suddenly everything the subject had before comes to an end, and a new subject is born out of it, right? And the new subject doesn't really necessarily have to be connected to the old subject. So the experience or the idea or the concept of seamlessness can be disrupted, can be deconstructed, right? And that's where the idea of plasticity comes in, and as Malabou would go on to theorize it subsequently in this book, right? So the normal idea of identity, the normal idea of life, is a process of continuous becoming, right? So the subject becomes and reinforces the whole idea of personality, and the subject becomes the personality, and everything around the subject, the entire experiencing in the world around, it serves to reinforce the idea, the concept, or the structure of the subject, as it were, but never contradicts it, never contradicting it, right? And then again, this is where the idea of plasticity or trauma would come in. They never disrupt identity in normal circumstances. There's gradual existential and biological incline, which can only ever transform the subject into itself. Does not, however, obviate the powers of plasticity of the same identity, but houses itself beneath an apparently smooth surface, like a reserve of dynamite hidden under the peachy skin of being for death. Right? So again, the metaphors chosen by Malabou are very interesting, and they're very loaded, as you can see. The idea of the dynamite, a reserve of dynamite hidden under the peachy skin. So there's always this latent quality of destruction, the latent quality of explosion of the subject, right? The subject can become something else entirely, and that can have necessarily no connection to what a subject otherwise is. Now, the interesting thing, if you look at the beginning of this line, where she talks about the gradual existential and biological incline, right? Incline obviously means an addition, just going up in time, right? So the subject will absorb more experience, will become fuller with experience, and then of course the final end will come. The subject will become, go into death. But the whole idea of the subjecthood, in a way, normally is considered to be an incline, a steady and stable incline. But she talks about plasticity in a way that can disrupt this idea of incline, this identity, which is an identity of incline. So inclination just goes on from a certain position, and it has a linear process. So the linearity of the subject, in other words, can be disrupted by the always already potential of plasticity, which acts, or which is there as a house of dynamite, a reserve of dynamite. So as a result of serious trauma, and this is the first time the word trauma comes in. So as we can see, Malabou talks about disruption as a cognitive condition, right? Disruption as a psychological condition. So it's not something which just happens from the outside, but also something which happens inside the subject. And it almost has, it's a combination of centripetal and centrifugal feels. Right? The subject becomes something else. And of course, the trauma comes from the outside. So in that way, it's centripetal, but also the subject connects to the trauma in a way which is very plastic. And that makes it centrifugal. So it's a dual process of centripetal and centrifugal feels that Malabou is, seems to be hinting over here, right? And she goes on to say, as a result of serious trauma, or sometimes for no reason at all, the part splits and a new, unprecedented persona comes to live with the former person and eventually takes up all the room. Now, what's interesting over here is the spatial metaphor that Malabou uses in the end of the sentence, takes up all the room. So there seems to be a finite space of the subject. The subject inhabits a finite space of selfhood. So selfhood seems to be described over here as a space, a finite space. So this is a space of selfhood, which is supposedly unique, supposedly linear, supposedly seamless in quality. Now what happens due to trauma, or sometimes for no reason at all, and this is where the absurdity of accident comes in as well, right? So a new, unprecedented persona is generated. It's almost like a recreation or a new birth of the subject. And that comes to live with the former person and eventually takes up all the room. So there does seem to be a territorial quality about trauma here as well, in terms of how the new subject which emerges takes up the entire territory of the older subject, and that becomes the entirely new subject, and the old subject gets completely pushed into oblivion. So there seems to be a very dramatic disruption, a very dramatic disconnect between the old and the new subject. And this hiatus, this disruption, is where the trauma is produced. In other words, what we're looking at here is trauma not necessarily as a passive process, but trauma as an active, regenerative, almost perversely productive process. It produces a new persona which has got no connection whatsoever with the earlier persona. So this disruption, this lack of seamlessness between the older and the earlier, newer persona is something which becomes the space of trauma. That's where the trauma as a process comes in. Right, so it takes up all the room. And an unrecognizable person whose present comes from no past, whose future harbors nothing to come, an absolute existential improvisation, right? So again, this phrase is interesting, existential improvisation. So it seems to have a permanent ad hoc condition, a permanent ad hoc quality. It's almost a state of permanent suspension between different kinds of subject positions. So the unrecognizable persona comes into being from no past. So there is no teleological or temporal connect. It's a suddenness of the subject which has been dramatized away up. There is a suddenness of subject which is produced due to trauma, and that sudden subject produced out of the trauma has no bearing whatsoever with the idea of the earlier subject, and is completely disconnected from that. A form born of the accident, born by accident, a kind of accident. So again, this is where the word accident comes into being, and as you can see how Malabou uses the word accident, it's almost like the way, I'm trying to make a connection here, but it seems similar to the way Butler used the word gender. So it's a process. So accident is an event as well as a process. Accident is an experience as well as a process. So the new subject becomes the accident. So it is born of the accident, it is born by the accident, but also equally it is the accident. It's a kind of accident, a process of unbecoming, shall we say, right? So that becomes the ontology of the accident. So the accident over here becomes interesting because it almost becomes a transitive verb, as we can see. It becomes a process of unbecoming. And then, of course, there's a dark comic quality to it as well, as Malabou goes on to say. It's a funny breed, a monster whose apparition cannot be explained as any genetic anomaly. A new being comes into the world for a second time out of a deep cut and that opens in a biography, right? So it's funny, and I'm going to end at this point, but the word biography is interesting over here because it almost has a textual quality to it. And this is why we find Malabou is such a complex and rich philosopher, because she's almost getting a textual analysis of trauma in a certain sense. So the writing of one's life, the inscription of one's life becomes interesting, and that becomes connected to trauma, because the way the life is written as a textual inscriptive process, that changes almost permanently due to the trauma. So the idea of the biography comes in, and a new being comes into the world almost through a textual process. So we have a very interesting correlation over here between the textual and the traumatic processes of unbecoming. So a new text emerges. It opens in a biography, and it's a deep cut that opens in a biography. So the process of writing someone's life, the textualization of someone's life, is disrupted permanently and deeply, and it's like a second coming, it's like a second birth. So as you can see, Malabou is using all these very interesting metaphors, but only to highlight the traumatic, the disruptive quality of the accident, which is the what the entire book is all about, right? So I'll stop at this point today. It's just introduction, and we'll spend a little bit more time with introduction in the subsequent lectures, and then we'll dive on to the main text of the ontology of the accident. Thank you for your attention.